for the afternoon session. So we've got a busy program with commencing with an assessment of the state of local government institutions in Africa, followed by discussion by Jamie and Jacqueline on an overview of LPSA resources, and then finishing off with a contribution from Boris and Martino on inclusive localized development, strengthening decentralization and multi-level government as an opportunity for that. So quite a busy program for the afternoon. We'll keep each other occupied. I have the privilege of trying to get us through all of this and also keep the conversation on point and focus on why we are here. But let's start with Nick, who is going to talk about the assessment of the state of the institution. The popularity contest of who mentions the word local government in the Constitution the most, or stuff like that, but really about also the de facto real state of local government and decentralization in the countries that it looks at. So with that, Nick also gets 15 minutes, the clock says, but he promised he can do it in 15. So anyway, but there will be no beep at 15, but maybe we will beep at 15. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Jaap, and apologies in advance for breaking, I think it's collective rule, but Jaap seemed very convinced that it was a good rule in terms of having the slides. I don't think most people would consider me a rule breaker normally, but I can assure you that this is all in the spirit of challenging centralized decision-making and power. There you go. So I have the pleasure of presenting a recent report that we did at LPSA. So LPSA, of course, has many roles, as I think we'll be discussing later this afternoon. But one of those roles is to generate information, data, and evidence to support its objectives and activities. And it's developed methodologies to analyze the extent of local self-governance across the world. And this report was based on that methodology and was released in January of this year, indicative of certain patterns. And there are two objectives that we wanted to achieve. One was to, within the sample of countries, to simply understand the structure of the subnational arrangements. You know, how many tiers of subnational governance are there? How many different types of entity operate at which level? These kinds of questions. And then secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, what is the nature of these entities? Are they devolved? Are they deconcentrated? Are they other? Can they be described as some other kind of entity or a hybrid of different models of local government? To come to a conclusion, which is that, to answer the key question, does the country in question have, quote, real empowered local government? And when we started developing the methodology and looking at what other people had done, we found that there is actually no globally recognized agreed metric of local empowerment at the local government level that looks at all of these factors, perhaps driven by an observation that we lack a sort of a common definition of local government. If you speak to a legal scholar or a political scientist or an economist or a public administration expert, to get them to say what they think a local government is, then you'll get very different answers. Political scientists will talk about local democracy and elected councils, and economists will look at decentralized budgets and so on and so forth. So we tried to sort of address this, and the whole purpose really is to make a contribution towards filling this knowledge gap that we found existed. So of course, to conduct any kind of assessment of whether a country has a real, quote, real local government, we have to start with a definition. So we came up with a definition as written here, which really is actually based largely on an IMF definition that has existed for quite some years, perhaps with some small modifications. But it's a fairly recognized definition, and it focuses on this concept of corporate body. So a subnational government, in our view, in the view of our methodology, has to be a distinct legal entity, separate from the central government, similar to the idea of a company. You know, a corporate private sector company will have its own board of directors. It will have its own chief executive officer and staff that implements the role of the company. It certainly has its own budget and resources to spend as it sees fit. So we use that analogy and simply apply it to public sector functions. And then we look at whether the entity has, you know, political, administrative, and fiscal autonomy and authority to respond ultimately to the needs and priorities of their constituents. And as Jaap mentioned, we're very much concerned with the de facto or the actual situation on the ground, rather than necessarily what the law says. We're interested to know what the law says, of course, but we based our assessment on observations of what happens in practice, and to do that, we worked with local experts in each of the countries that we did the assessment, because they obviously have considerable knowledge of what happens in practice. And just to unpack it's a bit small on the screen there, but you'll see a highly realistic diagram of a human being depicted on the slide there, that tries to take these three elements of a corporate body. So you'll see there in the head, or the brain of the body, we have political leadership. So we contend that, you know, local governments as a corporate body, first of all, must have their own political leadership, and furthermore, they must be autonomous. They must have authoritative decision-making power, independent of higher level governments. And then, secondly, in the middle there, the beating heart of the body is the administrative aspect. So you're thinking about who runs the day-to-day activities of local government. So the civil servants in the offices, the chief executive officer, and the staff. Of course, corporate bodies must have, but also they must control. In other words, they must appoint, they must manage, they must promote, they must have the power to dismiss their own officers and staff. Similarly, they must be able to determine their own organizational structure. We were talking over lunch about the lack of control over organizational structure resulting in some strange things, like urban areas that have no agriculture sector having an agricultural officer. This may have something to do with the fact that local entities cannot determine what positions and staff exist. And then thirdly, corporate entities, local governments, if they are a true corporate body, they must be able to control their own finances. You know, they must be able to own their own assets. They must be able to engage in financial transactions independently of the higher level government. In other words, corporate bodies must be separate, autonomous legal entities that can sue and be sued. And I think, you know, the methodology, we're not going to go through the methodology in any more detail, but it asks questions in each of these areas to try and measure the extent of authority and control that local governments have in these three dimensions of decentralization. And what we found is that you know, when you start to view local governments in these terms, you begin to realize that what might be termed or referred to as a local government is not actually, in fact, in practice, a fully devolved entity. And as part of this, we developed, I can do this, not working. Can we get the next, there we go. We developed 4 kind of categories of subnational governance entity. So on the right-hand side there in red, we have fully devolved governments with autonomy and authority. This is the gold standard, if you like. And on the left, in blue, we have what we categorize as non-devolved institutions. So these would be your deconcentrated entities or field offices of central government, which we observe in some countries. And then a couple of categories somewhere in between. So we have, devolved entities in orange there that are devolved, but have some limitations in their autonomy and authority in terms of the political, administrative, and fiscal aspects. And we have this category called hybrid, which are entities that may have some aspects of what you would expect a devolved local government to have, but in other areas, less so. So there may be politically, maybe elected political leadership with some decision-making power. There may be an officer employed by that local government, but they may not have control over those officers. They may have a budget, but ultimately they have significant restrictions in how that budget is allocated. And so you have a somewhat incomplete devolution of powers to those governments. And the methodology is a series of questions which, by the end of it, tells you roughly which kind of category the local governance institution of that particular country could be considered to belong to which one of these 4 categories. And so what we have here are just some selected country examples purely for illustrative purposes. I'm not going to discuss each of the boxes and the respective colors in detail, but what this serves to show is that there's a lot of diversity in both structure and in nature. Henry was saying earlier that there is not one central model, single model that local governments look like or adhere to, and this shows to prove that point. We have a lot of diversity. We have some countries like Uganda, which has 4 or 5 different tiers of local governance, whereas in Malawi there is essentially 1 layer of local governance. And we have some countries where all of the tiers of government are fully devolved, like in South Africa. We have other countries like Ethiopia where we can consider some levels to be devolved, some levels to be somewhat hybrid, and some to be non-devolved. And so there's a huge amount of diversity in the nature of these local governments, but we still refer to them all as local governments, and that can sometimes cause problems when we analyze for other purposes. So this is what we found in terms of looking at individual countries. And apart from Kenya, when we look at the main local level, so the methodology looks at all the different tiers, regional, local, urban, and lower local levels. But if you take the main, what is considered to be the main local level of government in each of the countries that we looked at, so in Kenya's example, of course, it would be county. We found that in most countries, the local governments are not fully devolved. In fact, they have significant restrictions in their autonomy to the extent that that we consider them to be hybrid entities. I mean, as I said, this is a small sample of countries, and so it is not necessarily representative of the continent as a whole, but it gives you a sense of the dominant form of local governance, at least in the countries we observed, with really only Kenya and South Africa showing significant levels of devolution. And in that sense, it shares some commonalities with the Asia region. We're currently doing some work in Asia as well on this methodology. And there's a lot of diversity there as well, but with sort of hybrid and non-devolved as the more, I would say, common categorization observed in those countries. So there's some similarities there. So why, the main question next would be, why are there so few genuine or real local governments? And well, there are three principal reasons based on our methodology. The first is that there are often very significant limits to political autonomy that are enjoyed by local councils or equivalent. In some countries, we observe that council decisions, whether that's policies or legislation or regulations, cannot be enacted or implemented until they are approved by high levels of government. So political autonomy is conditional on decisions made by central government. Similarly, in many countries, we observe that at the local level, the local council have members that are representatives of higher political office. So that is clearly problematic if those individuals are representing the national government rather than local constituents. Or simply, it could be that political leadership is appointed by a high-level government. So Nicholas was saying, in Ghana, many of the councillors are actually simply appointed by the central government, which, as voting members, obviously constrains the autonomy of the local council. The second sort of category of restrictions are on the administrative dimension. So in several countries, we saw that the chief executive officer of local governments, they have different names, but your commissioner or your municipal secretary or the top civil servant operating in the local government is often appointed and managed by a high level of government and report to the higher level of government, whether that be a ministry of local government or a public service commission or equivalent, with the local council having limited authority over that individual in terms of management, direction, appointment, removal, etc. Or there could be a reliance on staff seconded from national ministries. So you're not, in many countries we saw that there was an inability to hire own staff. And then thirdly, as we've also discussed, an inability to determine your own organizational structure. So you're restricted in responding to your local requirements by requiring approval to hire more staff positions in particular areas, which obviously limits your scope for implementation. And then thirdly, on the fiscal side, it was very common to observe in many countries local government budgets requiring formal approval by higher level authorities. So in other words, local governments cannot, strictly speaking, always decide how to spend the resources that they have. And often budgets are adjusted in accordance with national priorities, whether that be by the executive or whether the budget has to be approved by the national parliament, who subsequently edits or changes particular budget lines to match national priorities. Or there can be sort of more subtle restrictions. Obviously, local governments rely on fiscal transfers to a great extent in most countries. In and of itself, this is not necessarily a highly restrictive arrangement, but occasionally those fiscal transfers are highly conditional, sometimes earmarked for very specific purposes, to the extent that really the ability of local governments to decide how much to spend on specific things vanishes. And we observe that in one or two countries as well. And so in terms of the implications, our view is that, if you cannot determine your own policies in line with the needs of your local constituents because of political interference, if you cannot select and manage your own officers and staff to implement those policies, and you cannot allocate your available resources to finance those policies, then can you really be considered a real or genuine or fully fledged devolved local government? And our contention is not. And when we were doing the assessment, as I said, we were focused on the de facto situation versus the de jure. And in some countries, the de jure is very clear. The Local Government Act will say the chief executive officer will be appointed by the minister. Yeah, so it's pretty clear that that is the situation. In other countries, the law says, well, no, the local government can appoint the CEO, but in practice, in reality, they're appointed or at least strongly recommended or seconded. And so there's either strong de jure law in place that restricts autonomy, or it's an implementation gap between the law and overall practice. And this obviously has significant implications more broadly for local democracy and urbanization. We heard earlier about the nature of urbanization in Africa, and particularly lower local governments and urban level governments that lack major autonomy and authority is problematic and will likely result in under-provision of urban services unless resolved over the next period of time. Similarly, for decentralized cooperation, the limited authority and autonomy of local governments undermines development efforts from development partners who want to support them in service delivery and in local economic development and empowerment. If local governments lack authority in these areas, then such support may not reach its full potential. And then lastly, last point, we were looking very much on the nature of local governments. Are they legally a government, and are they in practice? Do they have the characteristics of a corporate body? But of course, that is only one aspect of this. The other aspect is on what is the functional remit of those local governments? You may be a fully devolved government, but if you don't have any real responsibilities in terms of sectors, health, education, and so on, then so what? And I think one of the things that we will be looking at as we roll out the methodology and develop it further and so on, is to take it a step further and try to look at what the functional remit of local governments are, to provide a broader perspective on how that looks, because without functions, empowerment to local citizens cannot really be developed. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to receive any comments or questions, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was very, very interesting. A bleak picture overall. I think doesn't inspire much confidence. Unfortunately, we have a lot of work lined up for us. You broke all the rules, but that's fine, because it was worth it. It was really important that we had to hear this. And you couldn't do this in one slide. I get it. I get it. So thanks very much. I don't know whether we should have an expansive discussion on this now, or rather fairly quickly move on, other than to say if there is any sort of questions of clarity, just on something that you didn't understand or want to get a quick input on. I've got one small question, but Betty, please go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. A very practical small question. What was the criteria for choosing the country? And then also Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, anything else you see in,
Can I first throw in my question, and then we take two more, and then, so just in the interest of time, is there anyone else who wants to just get a, Henry, Gertrude, do you have one? You go first.
So no, really, I just wanted to thank you, Nick, for this study. And for me, what triggered me is it touched on one of the biggest questions I continue to ask myself as I work with the local governments. for which I had a kind of answer, and I don't know if you came across that similar answer. When I started working with local governments in Uganda, I'm a lawyer by profession. So that was the first question I put to the stakeholders, government, when they were talking about empowering them and giving them the autonomy and all that stuff. So I put the question to them, I said, what about the corporateness of government in local government? And the answer was, government is not supposed to operate as a corporate entity. So in practice, I continue to find that is kind of the perception and perspective governments hold. And maybe that also responds a little bit to what we got from Ghana, the economy being left out, because the governments don't think that that's the business of local governments anyway. So I would have loved to hear a little bit more in your conclusion where we should take it in terms of that direction, because now they're talking about local economic development, and that calls for the corporateness of local government.
Sorry, mine is about the three classifications of autonomy that you were looking at. The second one, administrative autonomy. Just curious, from the countries that you actually surveyed, is it possible that a country could have political autonomy and financial autonomy, but not have administrative autonomy?
Then we're going to hand over to. Say again? Well, maybe we should, no, not discussion, just sort of queries on the methodology and the countries. And so I might, and then we can wrap it up into a conversation on more substantive issues later. A quick one. Did you see in the analysis, is there any distinction in outcomes between cities and the rest of local government? Is that bleak picture, can we basically say that applies throughout the local government systems, whether you are a capital city or a rural town? This is pretty much what you find. That's just sort of, I know it's maybe difficult to answer, but this is my question. So maybe let's have those questions answered by Nick, and then we move on with the promise of a more full discussion later on.
So on the question of the country selection and what next, I think the honest answer, Jamie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's essentially where we had limited resources from our donor to conduct a certain number of countries, and we focused on countries where we had good local expertise to help us carry out this analysis. But the objective is to expand to the work to every country on the continent, because only then will we have a true picture of the situation completely. But initially we did 7, and I think the discussions over the course of the next few days, one of them will be around how do we, expand the sample for the reasons that you say. On the question of corporate, yes, I mean, one of the things that was very common when looking at when doing these assessments was, when we looked at a country fresh off the bat and said, okay, are there local governments? And the answer would be yes. Do they have political leadership? Yes. Do they have a CEO? Yes. Do they have a budget? Yes. We have local governments. But then you ask, well, okay, who appoints the administrative head? Oh, the central government, of course. Or does the budget have to be approved by the regional government or by the national government? Of course, that's standard, right? But and so there are these assumptions that this is, quote, normal for a fully autonomous local government to have to put up with. But we, of course, know from other regions in the world that these restrictions do not exist. And as a result, those local governments have significantly more autonomy. Perhaps not as many countries as we would like, but it is possible to have a system where those kinds of impediments or processes are not present. And you're right. If we want those entities to really step up and deliver on the key policies of the day, then they need to be corporatized. They need to have decision-making power that is not going to be annulled or discredited in some way by higher level governments. And that is something that I think is gradually understood as we look into more and more countries. On the methodological question, yes, absolutely. So there are countries that have, let's say, imbalanced decentralization across the 3 dimensions. So there may be, it's pretty common for most entities to have some form of political leadership. Mostly it's elected. Often they'll have some decision-making power over their budget and so on. But their CEO, they don't get to decide who it is, and they certainly don't get to manage who it is. So there are countries in the sample that have different levels of autonomy in those three areas. Our methodology is basically puts you in a category based on the lowest score in the three categories. So even if you have a decent degree of fiscal or political autonomy or decentralization, but you lack administrative powers, then that's going to hold you back from becoming fully devolved. Because really, to enjoy the benefits of full devolution, we believe that you need sufficient levels of autonomy across all three dimensions. So that's how the methodology works. And then, yeah, on your question, yeah, there is some diversity. I was actually, we would have to go country by country, I guess, which is probably not time for that now. But yeah, you do see within the same level of local, within the same tier, you do see some differences in the level of autonomy based on whether they're urban or rural, or whether they're cities or whatever. So, and this is common in other countries as well. I was looking at, we're doing this in Asia as well, and I was looking at the Pakistan profile, and there they have essentially non-devolved entities everywhere, apart from two of the provincial capitals, which could be considered at least hybrid. But apart from those two, nothing. So the methodology allows us to distinguish between those two categories. Obviously, there's limitations to the how we present it on a diagram, and we can't assess every single entity. So we take a fairly broad brush approach, looking at, on average, at this level, how do they operate? Yeah.
Great. Let's give Nick a round of applause. And I think the one question that I want us to sort of reflect on upon, especially if we go into the next session, is, yeah, so this is very clearly an LPSA product activity. What are your thoughts on going forward with this? More of this, less of this, a different kind of doing this, so that we take this important work forward. Right, thanks again, Nick, and moving along swiftly to Jamie and Jacqueline for the input on the overview of LPSA resources. Over to you.
How many minutes do
I don't know. All the rules have been broken now. I don't know where. It says.
5 minutes. We'll try to do it in 25.
Okay, excellent. And at the end of your input, when we go for the tea break, there'll be a little surprise.
Oh, well, in that case, I better hurry up. I'm
Here we go.
curious to know what the surprise is. No, thank you all. I'm not breaking the rules quite as badly as Nick is. But I had the privilege of sending some stuff to the printer. So rather than presenting 30 slides, we put the full slide deck in your notes, and I'm only presenting 5 or 6. Okay. But I'll try to do those as expeditiously as possible based on 5 key points that I would like to touch on. And the question really is about building on this morning session and what Nick just presented. You know, how do we disrupt, and maybe even why do we disrupt the debate on decentralization and localization, and what does LPSA hope to do about it? That first causes me to have to touch briefly on, for those who haven't been part of the alliance, who are we and what do we do? And why disrupt the debate? Why is there a need to disrupt the debate? Point 2. Point 3 is evidence-informed policy making and the state of evidence. What would we like to know? What kind of evidence would we like to have? At least that is my attempt at getting to a first list of questions. I like to think that I'm really good at asking dumb questions. So I came up with a list of dumb questions that I would like to know about the state of decentralization and localization in Africa. What tools do we have to elevate the debate? We've been working a lot on developing a number of tools. And finally, I'll pass to Jackie to talk a little bit about what LPSA is doing in terms of localizing women's economic empowerment in Africa. So that's my ambition, and the clock is heavily ticking, and I have a feeling I'm going to be interrupted by loud beeps in 20 some minutes. Again, I'll try to be very brief about LPSA, but we're a young organization established in 2021, incorporated in 2022 as a not-for-profit. We were built on a research initiative previously at the Urban Institute, which was started in 2010. So we're young, but we come with a bag of knowledge and tricks. Really, the intellectual foundation of LPSA goes back all the way to the late 1990s, when many of the founders were part of the Fiscal Decentralization Initiative. That was a Soros found an Open Society Institute funded effort anchored at the World Bank Institute. So we're young, but we're old. Our mission is to promote inclusive, equitable societies and sustainable development by enhancing our understanding of decentralization and localization as complex, cross-cutting, and multi-stakeholder reforms. Right? And what we are is an alliance of advocates for inclusive and efficient decentralization and localization. What we are is an alliance of people, not of institutions. So we're different in the sense. And we do three things in line with our theory of change. We do knowledge development, knowledge sharing, and convening outreach and field building. And the basic crux of our theory of change is that kind of divided we fall, united we stand, right? If we pursue decentralization, and we don't talk among different stakeholders, decentralization is likely to fail. However, if we work together and we exchange knowledge, we learn from each other, and very importantly, we work at the country level and not just at the global level, to empower and inform country level advocates, we can reach more resilient, inclusive, sustainable development. That's the crux of our theory of change. And I think to some degree that is hopefully reflected in the people that are in this room today. In order to achieve inclusive and effective decentralization, localization, and multi-level governance, you must have on board central government, KK, you must have on board local governments, you must have on board researchers, you must have on board development partners, you must have on board civil society organizations, sectoral stakeholders. You need everyone, because everyone only sees a piece of the elephant. And so in order to move forward, we need to move forward together. And that, I think, to some degree is the secret sauce of LPSA. We have organizations that are great partners, that have knowledge, that have, wonderful experience, but not necessarily all the experience, right? And we are not trying to copy or improve upon any of that. We simply want to learn from everyone's experience and bring together the different voices because it is needed. I'm failing to mention that, of course, it's also cross-disciplinary. So we have lawyers in the room, there are economists in the room, there are sector specialists, there are all sorts of disciplines involved, public administration experts. So together, we understand decentralization better than if we try it alone, and without everyone coming together, we believe this will fail. And that gives us, we hope to have thereby the value add of saying that our expertise is in the multi-level governance system, which requires the expertise of everyone in the room. By bringing that together, by leveraging the collective knowledge, we add to the debate, and we hopefully help elevate the debate. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip how we are structured, but you already have gathered from some discussions that we have working groups. We're a very funny organization. We decided to write subsidiarity into our own policies, because why not? So everything that can be done decentralized by working groups is done by working groups. And the Secretariat only does things that it needs to step in for efficiency purposes and scale economy purposes. That happens when your executive director is an economist. We are, sometimes I refer to myself as the Minister of Devolution, and the governors and the mayors run the country. let me move to the why disrupt decentralization in Africa. And I apologize because of the rule Jaap imposed cruelly to have few slides. The slides had to be a bit smaller. On the left, we see the Local Government Index, which is an index created by the Varieties of Democracy project, showing that in the Americas and in Europe, we have a much higher degree of decentralization effectively, or local government autonomy, than we have in Africa and Asia. And that, I think, is corresponding with the findings that Nick is having. He didn't present Asia, but Asia looks very similar. If you have Indonesia and maybe the Philippines or something, and after that it is a lot of non-devolved and hybrid types of local governance institutions. If you look at Latin America, excluding the Caribbean, you look at North America and Europe, you see a lot of real devolution, not exclusively. There are countries, and I like to pick, there's a bunch of Dutch people in the room, so why not? Dutch mayors are appointed by the king, all right? Appointed by the king, so they are not full devolved, they are limited devolved. Just starting off with one example. But that point notwithstanding, we see a lot more devolution in Europe and other places. The other thing we have, another concern, in particular, when we look over time, and in the handout I have the 3 time periods. We look from 1980 to 2000, based on, again, VDEM data. We see a lot of progress, local government scores going up at the country level in Africa. We don't see any backsliding, or hardly any backsliding. 2000 to 2015, the MDGs, that was a bad time, no pay attention to local governments, but no backsliding, progress. 2015 to 23, we see backsliding. We see countries where there are local government index is declining over that period. Of course, that's only, so that's the SDGs, and SDGs were supposed to be localized. What's happening? I mean, probably there's obviously a trend towards greater authoritarianism around the world, and that may be related, but the key is we should be paying attention to this. This is important. So there is backsliding, there is a concern, we should be paying attention, we should be measuring and discussing this. Now, what would be the types of questions that as I said, what are the dumb questions I would like to ask? And it's great, we have smart people here, so hopefully collectively over the next couple of years we can answer these. First question is, if we believe local governments and regional governments are important, then how many are there in Africa? Right, dumbest question I could come up with. How many are there? Any guesses? No guesses. No, we know what our country has, but in Africa, total, in the 33 countries where I could find data, we have 11,500 local governments. There's 23 of us today. Oh man, that's a lifetime worth of work. Anyway, good to know, right? That was the only fact I could look up. The rest I couldn't answer properly. That one, at least I gave you some. What do we know about the nature of regional? Now, I use a slightly nuanced term. I don't try not to say local government or regional government, because as Nick pointed out, many don't meet the definition. So I say regional or local governance institution. Okay, so everything is a regional or local governance institution, but you need to meet the specific definition to be a local government. Okay, what do we know? Well, now we know 7 countries. Hopefully we will know more if we can roll it out. To Patty's question, why not Francophone Africa? The manual to decide what type of country you are is 100 pages long. We figured we get the methodology right before we translate it. Because once we translate it, you can't change the methodology anymore. So you better be sure that we get it right. But yes, we would love to apply this. We're applying it in Latin America in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank. We're applying it with Asian Development Bank and other partners in Asia. Africa has a lot of countries, 50 with a population of more than 1 million. So a lot of work to be done. So until we finish that, we don't know a lot about local governance institutions in Africa. What do we know about the multi-level governance systems in which those local government entities operate, right? Because you can be a corporate body that's fully empowered and have $0. We're an NGO. We know all about that, right? That's how we started off. Incorporated, but no money. The environment in which we operated was not conducive to what we were doing until we were able to work in that environment. For local government, same thing. You might be a corporate entity, but you might be in an intergovernmental system that doesn't give you functions, that doesn't do other things. So we need to know about political, administrative, and fiscal systems. What do we know about the de jure and de facto assignment of functions across the continent? That is a point I made this morning when Nick said, you know, who in Africa does this? Who runs education at the local level? Tanzania does, but Tanzania also scores very low on the local governance institutions, right? They have no autonomy, so they local, but yeah, the central government sends the teachers, and then they pretend they're local government employees. So can we figure out consistently a de jure and a de facto situation on functional assignments? There are some partners that do good work, and on the de jure side, Commonwealth Local Government Forum does have for each of the Commonwealth countries a nice table on functional assignment, but it's law only, not de facto. 5, what do we know about revenues and expenditures by function in Africa for local governance institutions? Very, very little. OECD will tell you the aggregate, but not the breakdown, right? Aggregate is nice, it's a good beginning, but it's not the breakdown, and breakdown would reveal a lot more. So can we work with OECD and others to expand that data set? Some of the colleagues tomorrow will share some of their work on that question. But again, what do we know? Unfortunately, not very much. What do we know about public service delivery and the achievement of development outcomes within regional and local government jurisdictions in Africa? Again, almost nothing. Development doesn't happen at a national average. Development happens in specific places. And if you don't know where development is going well and where it's slow, you're not going to be able to change much. So disaggregated data on expenditures, disaggregated data on results, outputs, outcomes, by function at the local jurisdiction level is critical. Now, time won't allow me to go into the detail, but there are good experiences in some countries about localized SDG data at the subnational level. Brazil does a fantastic job, mostly in Latin America. There are some really good experience about doing some of this. Finally, what do we know about the content, ratification, and adherence to the African Charter on the values and principles of decentralization, local governance, and local development? I think that was the topic of last year's Africa School on Decentralization effort. I will let that speak for itself. But certainly, maybe when Boris talks, we can compare and contrast a little bit between Africa and Europe's experience. So what does LPSA hope to contribute, and where can we work together maybe to move the agenda forward a bit? I say we have 3, maybe 4 flagship tools that could be helpful in advancing the conversation in Africa and elsewhere. One is already emphasized by Nick. The intergovernmental profiles that Nick was showing earlier is part of the Logica framework. Logica is local governance institutions comparative assessment. We're very clever in acronyms. If you ever come up with the good acronyms, please let us know. We'll do another framework. Then we have our INFER framework, Intergovernmental Fiscal and Expenditure Review. Now that is actually a framework that the manual is still being finalized, but it actually builds on South Africa's Intergovernmental Fiscal Review. We just came up with a cleverer acronym, so it's more marketable. I used to live in Atlanta, and Coca-Cola was sold all over the world, the most popular drink in the world. It's just black water with sugar in it, but as long as you market it. Anyway, so that's a fiscal framework. It looks at disaggregated spending, revenues, and results whenever the data is available. Framework 3, multi-level governance as an opportunity or obstacle to development, MOOD framework. The MOOD framework builds on the Logica framework, but applies the questions to a specific development challenge. We have a lot of colleagues that are working on gender or climate or any specific development challenge. They don't have the time or patience or interest to learn all about local governance, but what they need to understand mostly is that they're failing because multi-level governance systems are weak. Jackie will give an example of childcare and women's economic empowerment in Africa. So that is a framework targeted not at us, people who work on the field of local governance, but who take kind of the basic methodology that we have and encourage colleagues in sectors to apply it so that they can realize that their problem is actually a multi-level governance problem. Okay. The fourth methodology, which is not here, that is at thinking inception stages, is a framework that looks at performance-based local management effectively, where the question is, if we have local governments that want to achieve results in a multi-level governance context, what do you need to look at? Big questions, big challenges. So that would be the fourth one if the opportunity arises for us to finalize that. Our aim is to answer the dumb questions I raised earlier with these instruments. So how many regional and local governance institutions are there in Africa? If we roll out Logica or the intergovernmental portion of that to all 50 countries, again, there's 55, but we don't, under 1 million population, we may not prioritize as much. We can answer that question more completely. We would know more about the nature of local governance institutions. There is a part that we didn't complete in the initial batch that looks at de facto functional assignment. How do we look at de facto assignment? Well, if you're responsible for education, what are the two most important inputs into education? You need a teacher and a school building. It's very hard to talk about de facto, but we can count teachers and we can count school buildings and we can figure out who does what. And so simple methodology, but very effective. So we have that data, for instance, in the US. By function, we know how many employees there are in each state, at state level, local government level, and federal level. We can quantify now the de facto situation in terms of functional assignments for the main functions. So building on those experiences, the Logica framework has a functional assessment tool. Not bad. The Logica country profile has an extended country profile with lots of questions about political systems, administrative systems, fiscal systems, all the details about these systems. But in addition to knowing the nature of the local governance institution, how do these systems work? Too many to really highlight here, but is there party control over the selection of candidates at the local level? Does the national party determine the candidates or the local party determines the candidate? Big difference, right? That you can be a corporate body, but if it's the national party that suggests which candidate can run for mayor, you're going to get a very different mayor than if it is the local primary election, for instance. So the Logica framework covers those more intricate questions as well. Infer is, and working on Infer together with the World Bank, asks lots of questions about revenue and expenditure by function for each local governance institution. Do we have in Kenya, I'm going to shame Kenya right now, do we have in Kenya county expenditure data by function? Sadly, no. We have it by county department, but not by county function. I hope that we can have maybe on Wednesday the controller of budget, and I don't know what, I brought Candy from the US, maybe we can bribe him or her and try to see if we can put that into the county IFMA system so that we can actually report on spending consistently by county function. Nigeria now has that at the state level. And I think our colleague on tomorrow hopefully will share a little bit. I think FCDO is trying to now also get them to provide that data at the local government level in Nigeria. And I'm sorry, maybe I'm stirring up some national pride here, but I don't think Kenya wants to be beaten by Nigeria in terms of public sector transparency. Just saying. Anyway, but you're starting to fall behind here. So Infer is a tool that could do that. But again, it just pulls data from country systems. So it's really, do the country systems provide that data? And then finally, what do we know about public service delivery and achievement of development outcomes? Again, disaggregated at the local level. In private conversations with the chair, it's something that Kenya is looking at and should be looking at. But unfortunately, it's not something that has emerged naturally, shall I say, from the devolution process. Again, there are countries that have really exciting maps, and in a longer presentation, there would be a map of Bolivia where you can go to every sustainable development goal and click, and it'll show you where water access is high, where is water access low, blah, blah, blah. That allows a government now to target their resources, both human resources and financial resources, to where the problems are the greatest, to ensure equitable service delivery. Can we use the methodologies we're developing to promote those discussions? Ha ha ha. 2 minutes. I'm going to stop the clock and pass over to Jackie to talk for a few more minutes about the last bullet.
Do I get 2 minutes or 5 minutes?
What do we think? What do we think? 5? She's in control of our lunches and dinners and other things. 10 minutes.
My background is actually gender equity and social inclusion. So this is already a very exciting moment for me to also learn from the experts in decentralization. But I'm also the project manager for this project, the Localizing Women's Economic Empowerment in Africa, which we're implementing in Kenya and Ghana. And our point of departure is that childcare is critical for women's economic empowerment and overall development, both at the local level and at the national level, because if you provide childcare, then women get to be more productive at work. They get even into the labor market. So ideally is if we can provide childcare, then women can contribute to even local economic development, as Nick was talking about earlier. But then we see in Kenya, and we haven't started in Ghana, we just started two months ago in Kenya. There are major systemic challenges in the childcare ecosystem involving different actors. So you can see on your screen a beautiful chart where we brought together the stakeholders from Intergovernmental Relations Committee, Technical Working Group, Intergovernmental Technical Working Committee. We have people from childcare, the childcare sector. We have people from the women's economic or women's empowerment sector. We have a very diverse group coming together and trying to understand what are the binding constraints within the childcare ecosystem, and also what are the challenges, and trying to understand how can we address these issues. So then the project is trying to develop intergovernmental policy solutions for the adoption, funding, and implementation of childcare as a tool really for women's economic empowerment. So we know that inclusive and effective multi-level governance systems are needed to ensure that stakeholders at all levels of society. So you can see there are so many actors within the sector, but there is a lot of focus at the national level and at the lower level, at the service provision level, at the facility level, because we have the civil society actors very active at the bottom, and a lot of development partners and working with national level ministries.
Jackie, one very important addition.
Yeah.
The Constitution in Kenya states verbatim that childcare is a county function. Black and white. No debate here. Black and white, it says early childhood development, yes, and then specifically childcare, county function.
Mhm.
So just to clarify, go on.
Yes. Thank you for that addition. Yes, so the Constitution requires that this is a devolved function to the counties. And we see a lot of actors within this sector, but unfortunately, where we have ineffective multi-level governance systems, multi-level governance can form an obstacle to provision of childcare services. And that's what we are seeing in Kenya, for instance. And you also realize that childcare and women's economic empowerment advocates are also not well versed on issues of decentralization. So we are here, you're here as decentralization as experts, but the people who are working within the childcare sector don't understand how public sector works, you know. So they are really trying to provide services, but they do not address the issues on both the challenges on intergovernmental systems. So they are all working at, we have the development partners supporting the national level to develop policies. But then they also come down, as I was sharing yesterday, they come down and support the civil society actors to provide services, childcare services, but you see them ignoring sort of the county level. You know, so the county is a missing middle within that system. So you only have funding going to the top and funding going to the bottom. But then you also see, even within the national level, there's a lot of focus on policy development without adequate consideration of funding constraints. And we almost got a bit of flack when we said, you know, when some of the actors said the counties don't have budgets for childcare, but it's true, because what they get is a budget for maternal health care, for early childhood education. So within that, we find that it is easier for them to invest in infrastructure, but not really in childcare provision. And we know that a lot of counties are interested in ribbon, or governors interested in ribbon cutting exercises. You know, the other challenge comes in, is childcare within social protection? Probably should it be in social protection? Should it be in pre-primary education? Where do we place it? Should it be at what? So there's some bit of confusion on administration. So at the county level, when we see the county missing out on in service provision, we cannot reach scale. So what you're seeing in the field is in the counties is because the provision is being done by the civil society organizations. It's something within markets, targeting the low-income women, but it's leaving out a very big population. Okay, so we cannot achieve scale, we cannot achieve sustainability if this continues, if the public sector is missing out within the sector. And you find that even when we say that counties are providing childcare, they're not actually providing. It is a civil society which then goes and consults the county. Can we set up this, you know, and just brand, oh, we are doing this in partnership with the county. But in actual sense, it is being funded, it is being implemented by the civil society. So the county is really missing out on the on service provision. So childcare remains small scale, it remains project-based, and therefore it remains unsustainable. Yeah, so I mentioned that development partners are not directly supporting counties. I have 5 seconds.
Been paused on 5 seconds for a minute.
Okay. So there's also a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, where you find several at the national level. We have different ministries trying to regulate the sector. So there's also lack of coordination at the national level horizontally, but then again vertically between the national level and the counties. So what are we doing as LPSA? First, we are facilitating a conversation that brings together all these different stakeholders. We're bringing together research institutions, we're bringing together the governance institutions, the childcare institutions, the childcare advocates, the women's economic empowerment advocates, and bringing them together to try and understand the political economy and identify even the constraints that are preventing the counties from being able to deliver these services. Another thing that we are trying to do, particularly this year, is to generate evidence to inform policy debate, because some of the questions that you're asking, we are also asking additional questions. And what kind of models, if counties were to provide this, how would that be done? What kind of models for regulation should be in place? Because is it better to regulate at the national level? Is it better to regulate at a local level? How would funding for childcare be done? You know, how do we get funding through the counties to provide subsidies possibly? And how do we implement? Should the counties provide childcare directly? Should they possibly subcontract to a service provider? Should they provide subcontract one or many, because they are quite a number? How do we, what kind of models would work in Kenya, and what kind of mixes of these models would work? And then finally, some of the questions we are asking, we are talking about, we are not clear about what our counties actually doing in terms of women's economic empowerment. What do we have administration, or do we have officers assigned to this to women's economic empowerment or childcare? What are they actually doing? Can we create country profiles to also create opportunities for the counties? Are there innovative strategies that counties are using so that people can also learn from, different counties can also learn from each other? And then within the next year, hopefully develop intergovernmental policy solutions and design a project within the last 2 years. The project we are hoping that it goes on for 4 years. That possibly we can knock on some doors. Jamie is very good at that. And hopefully even pilot with 1 or 2 countries, some kind of county level provision of childcare services. Yeah, so I'm sorry for going over. So that's what we're working on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let's give Jacqueline and Jamie a round of applause. I have a suspicion there was some tampering happening with the timing, but it's hard for me to say. But here we are. It was a fantastic input. Really give us a clear picture of the vision and strategies and tactics of the LPSA with also a very, I think, elucidating example of current work in childcare, and how I think that would then fall under the third sort of leg of how multi-level systems can be an opportunity or an obstacle for specific development challenges. And it just goes to show that when we talk about devolution, decentralization, it's not just a theoretical, conceptual, power-based discussion. It is about real implementation in specific sectors to deal with development challenges. So I've got a bit of a challenge now as a chair, because we should be having tea more or less now, but we've had a number of very interesting and fascinating inputs that of course is going to prompt some questions. So I'm just having a bit of a look at Jamie and Jacqueline. Is it okay if we have a bit of an engagement now and then? There we go. Okay, great. Because I think if we now go for tea and come back and have another presentation, and then I think we're going to lose track of what we just discussed. So we had the input from Nick, from Jamie and Jacqueline, all three sort of consolidated together in our minds. What are our questions and observations? Again, particularly with the aim of influencing how are we going to use LPSA as a vehicle going forward. So let me open it up, and maybe I should count the hands. I see Avril. Avril, you're number 1. Augustine, number 2. Paddy, number 3. Gertrude, number 4. And maybe we should stop there for now, and then otherwise we get. But I see you, Gertrude and Nick. So you'll be in the next round. So Avril, go for it.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for those presentations. It's, I guess, a question maybe for you, Nick. Other people have spoken to this, but when you were looking at the extent or the degree of autonomy that local governments have in your 3 realms or 3 areas, you mentioned obviously there might be a distinction between the laws that are in place, so the degree of autonomy on paper versus the degree of autonomy in practice. And I was wondering if in the scans, the assessments that you did, to what extent was there that dissonance between the laws that were in place and the practice? And where it is in place, did you learn anything, or did in the assessment that might suggest why, like what's inhibiting the fulfillment of their full decision-making autonomy? Yeah, just curious if you had any thoughts on that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think a couple of reflections on Nick's presentation, and maybe just a context. So in the thematic group, local democracy, we started off the discussion around really conceptualizing local democracy. What does it mean? Which relates to this. And I think in our reflections, we noted that because we have varied perspectives, sometimes we are not talking about the same thing, even when we talk about local government. And obviously, because we are talking about different things, we also do not have a shared understanding in terms of what is working and what is not working, because we are applying those in different contexts. Now, when Nick speaks about genuine local governments and using those three dimensions as a conceptual framework, I think overall, when you look at the state of affairs of local governance in this part of Africa, you actually see that probably we do not have local governments. And if that were to be a conclusion, the biggest question that I think we would have to ask ourselves is, first, is it worth concluding that way? Why must we conclude that way? But what does it mean for elevating the discussion going forward? And I think one missing link we noticed, at least, which I would like to reflect back in this setup, is the fact that oftentimes in our conversations, we do not have a practical linkage between ourselves at this level and actually those that take political decisions. So if you are a minister of local government in Ghana, and it's interesting that you actually have a minister of local government, because yeah, that already suggests something. And we have many of those across. You will see that there's so much preoccupation about local government reforms and all these, and a lot of resources that are put in there. But without having a shared conceptual understanding, are we reforming local governments? Or in fact, are we reforming things which are not in essence local governments? So my question to ourselves is, how do we really break this? And how can we ensure that conversations like these lead to a more constructive dialogue between ourselves at this level and the political policy decision makers? And I guess this is something that we'll have to continue to reflect on also maybe in the session of tomorrow. It's a point in the agenda that I want to put across.
When I did research on local government in Zimbabwe, the Ministry of Local Government was explicitly considered as part of local government. It was, oh yeah, the spot on question. Over to Patty.
Very interesting. I think I had sort of the same thought as Augustine has shared in terms of having a common understanding. But I also remember being in Addis at the African School of Decentralization, and particularly the facilitators, we were to use that charter as a reference for us in terms of bringing practitioners, but people who are interested in decentralization to equip themselves. And these were predominantly, I mean, they were all African actors around the table. So then it becomes quite surprising that in a document where we're talking about decentralization in Africa, we still refer to the IMF. I think it's also a bit of, what is our source of knowledge? Because I think there is a power in who defines, particularly on the African continent, because it speaks to who will drive the agenda. If we're still looking at the IMF for a definition, we're very far from the local government space itself. While it makes it very sunk and interesting. And why do I say this? Then I link it a bit to what we're seeing in Zambia, for instance, where we've had a long-standing debate and understanding of what decentralization is, because it's crafted even now into our constitution, but it has also gone, not too long ago, last year in March, we now actually have a costed national decentralization policy that's been costed and planned out for. So it's been a long time coming. But still at the center of this, and which was at the center of the Policy Act, tomorrow we'll hear from the Zambian speaker, is the fact that civil society have been missing, and they've been missing on defining as well. So just coming back again to who is defining a local government? Because I think that in different spaces, from Jackie's example, whoever provides a service is the local actor. So what has become much more important is then not the local government definition, but local actors. And whoever's showing up in that outfit, right? Is it the councillor? Is it the mayor? Is it the ward chairman? Who is providing the service? And sometimes also coming in as service providers, particularly in health and even community-based education. I mean, we've been talking a lot about education as well as an entry point, I think, for us to see decentralization and what that has actually meant. So when we talk about motivators today, I think this is some of the things that we sort of see. Can we see change in or appetite among central governments by looking at decentralization as a thing out there and not just the loss of power, but a gain in the ability to deliver a service, childcare, education, and health. So that was sort of my first question. But I also understand, Nick, you are working across different countries, across regions. So maybe having an IMF definition fits. But I think in there would have, moving forward, what would make sense is what makes sense for Africans. So from the African Charter all the way down to the diversity of civil society. And I know it's not an easy one, but just putting it out there. But then also thinking about the associations, for instance, that we have in the countries themselves, the local government associations, but also the regional associations that we have in East Africa and in other spaces. So I thought that could help us with definition, but I'm sure it also confuses us. So I know it's not an easy task. Then the next thing was also very much linked to this was data. I think on the continent as well, I mean, we're suffering from this. I also sit in a space where we talk about data from African statistics point of view, and data is flawed. I mean, there is just not availability of good data. I think there's availability of good data sitting in different desks and records and country offices, not a lot of sharing that's going on, but which is very critical for decision making and critical for even like, you know, looking at measurement. And a very small example here is that, you know, for instance, when you talk about, you know, local government index or all these other indexes, for citizens, there's such a distance to it because sometimes a bit like, what's the basis of that data? You know, I don't even trust Zambian census data because they didn't even count my grandmother's house. Do you know? So, I mean, right. So I think that there's a big question about where will we draw data to measure ourselves and where we are, right? Because it's a very big measurement question. Before we say this is where this particular local government is in an index, what is the basis of that data? In some spaces, very good data. In some spaces, somebody just scratched the questionnaire before it had to go for the IMF deadline or whatever deadline that was. So I think that's very critical. And then just my last one is how we bring in the vision back. And I'm looking at Jackie and Jamie, because I think we also need to think of what are those things that are driving African governments who are doing even a bit of movement where we see it. And that gives us a bit of energy, I think, because we need to look at, I mean, we talked about it yesterday, influencers also in the local government space, where we've seen influencers, even though sometimes the system is not working and maybe sort of sits in a hybrid or even in between the gap. What is working there that we could leverage to bring up a certain standard? And then I guess, you know, questions around standards is something that the experts around this group could answer more. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Gertrude.
Yeah, thank you so much once again to everyone who's done the presentations, but mine were just mere reflections, particularly that coming from Jamie and Jacqueline's presentation. Of course, I had the overall thinking on the need to build dialogue with governments. I think that's where we are at this stage, where we need to bring back the decision makers, the presidents, the ministers in the room to begin having this conversation on where they're taking the decentralization policies. Because where I'm coming from in this region, much of that rests on their interests. If I sat in a room with, for example, His Excellency Museveni, he will always say, I started this with my resistance council committees. So he owns that in that sense. But again, as he gives it off as something he can also clear away if he wanted to. So this conversation is important. And for me, I think this is where entities like LPSA comes in. And I want to thank you for the work that you've done. The other area that has piqued my interest are the tools. Because when I reflect on the work that we do in our region as associations, increasingly today we're grappling with trying to maintain the autonomy of local governments to make things work. So the research component, of course we do, but it needs that external eye. So tools that you've put forward, for me, when I look at them, really speak to the current problems, and they're very important. Today, local governments are being asked to be accountable for performance. They're grappling with intergovernmental fiscal transfer issues. So my question then would be, what is the strategy for LPSA to harness these resources and use them and pass them on to the voices that be, even to governments, to utilize them so that the local governments can come back in the picture? Because those weaknesses in those areas are the hit points where the ignoring local governments come into play, and they move on to who is actually playing, who is actually turning up. And that takes me to the discussion around civil society. The practical experience I've found is still around accountability issues, who's showing up. And that is what you're seeing, where people come down and instead of going through the structure of county or local governments, they end up working with the civil society themselves. Back then in Uganda, we tried out something where there was a lot of finger pointing between local governments and civil society in terms of accountability for the services going on down there. And transparency was a key issue on table between the two institutions. The other, because one, the civil society was not really looking at itself as a service deliverer, but a third estate of sorts. I'm here to check your performance. And that didn't sit down well, because the local governments were saying, you're taking on our role, and at the same time you're checking us. So who is checking you? So it became a rhetoric. So we tested out a model, and the association in Uganda, ULGA, partnered with the Accord Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment to build a relationship and partnership with civil society and local governments to promote service delivery. And we believe that that test that was done has fed into what is manifesting today. There's a bit more civility. You see there's attempts through civic engagement platforms and the planning and budgeting processes to have synergies between civil society and local governments, to the extent that areas where we piloted some of that work, they have what they call the development partner coordination desks in the local government. So those are some of the small tests that could be looked at to see how we can provide healing in areas where there are those gaps. Women economic empowerment, we need to move beyond political representation. I think that's where we've stopped. Where is the 1/3? Or a man has spoken, where is the woman leader? We need to move beyond that, then we can fall to the level where we want to take women economic empowerment. I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gertrude. So I don't think it's going to work to open up another round of conversation after we answer this, because I think then we're going to run into timing issues, and your surprise is waiting outside. So can I ask Nick and Henry, can you ask your question in 1 minute? Then we throw it in the pot and then we have it all. So Nick and then Henry.
So we are not seeing, devolution as the end state. I think this is what we need to build some conceptual clarity, so that one government will come in that, all they think about is and we are practicing, devolution in different aspects. The first time devolution as an administrative. Now that clarity. Second is that and so what? Decentralization. In all of these categories, we need to have some information so that actually devolution improves services or decentralization is providing better services. We have to answer that. And 2002, Egypt in Libya was in the world. He did that stock taking. And he unbundled this whole decentralization aspect and gave some and see which countries are falling into which countries. Since then, we haven't done that. Nobody has fallen into that. Then, I think beggars also did a correlation between the degree of decentralization or the type of decentralization and the MDGs. And he showed that the more a district or local government practicing decentralization, and he defined it in terms of the higher the achievement from the MDG. If we can show that, and that's what I think reach the expectation from money, if we can see that, evolution by this services provide better services to the people, then government will be able. If we say that maybe of the fiscal decentralization is a better option for a unitary state to avoid disintegration. Because mind you, autonomy, there's no country or there's no political dissent or there's no country which will accept total autonomy, except Ethiopia, which in their constitution is written that you can secede. There's nowhere in the world that you can devolve totally that you're autonomous. Otherwise, you are a state on your own, isn't it? Except Ethiopia, which is doing this very well. But so we, but it's the constitution, isn't it? But so we need some, I think we can take this up. Yes.
Henry, 1 minute.
Yeah, sorry, I'll start where Nick has stopped on the question of Ethiopia and the constitutional provision on secession. But then I go back to Nick's table, and then I realize that Ethiopia ranks lower than Kenya and South Africa insofar as autonomy is concerned. What explains that? To Jamie, I know you mentioned something about function disaggregated data insofar as Kenya is concerned, that we don't have that data. I'm not sure at what level you wanted, or rather you would have recommended that data to be had, whether it's at the national level, at the county level, as a country profile. But because I know for a fact that when you look at county integrated development plans, when you look at annual development plans for counties, when you look at their own budget, program-based budgets, you'll find very clear data that it actually even looks at the previous cycle to be able to analyze how much has been spent on agriculture, how much has been spent on health, and each and every, most of the functions largely. So it's important for you maybe to elaborate at what level you wanted that to be done, so that at least we can see what value we can be able to add. And lastly, to Paddy, I'm very happy to hear Paddy talking about, we met at the African School last year in Ethiopia, but I'm very happy to hear her talking about who defines this. I mean, obviously when you were thinking about the African School on decentralization, it didn't just come out of the blues. It came from Prof funding my travel to Switzerland to be part of the summer university on decentralization. And the question that I was asking myself is, how feasible is it for us to have our own conversations on the African continent with respect to questions on decentralization, share our own experiences, and chart our own path insofar as good governance is concerned? But then again, I look back at Jamie's slide on disrupting the debate on decentralization and localization in Africa, and I ask myself, what are we disrupting, Jamie? Where is the debate on decentralization and localization in Africa at the moment, right? So if we know where the debate is, then we can be able to clearly define what it is that we're actually disrupting. There are institutions that have been working on decentralization and localization in Africa. We have an African Charter, as you mentioned, of decentralization, that the question, and the African Union Department for Political Affairs is actually overseeing the implementation of the Charter. Then the question is, do we envision a collaborative approach to the whole conversation that LPCA is trying to have in Africa, or are we looking at it from a disruptive kind of perspective? And back to Paddy, did we have to wait for LPCA to disrupt the debate on decentralization in Africa? Thank you.
All right, let's throw it back at the panel. And for a quick last word before we close for tea and continue the conversation after that. Clearly, there's real engagement, and that's really encouraging. But just some quick final words from the panelists before we break for tea. Nick.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
I'll try and, yeah, I'll pick the hardest ones. Yeah, exactly. There's no one from the IMF in the room, right? Oh, great. So I can criticize them at will. Excellent. I'll start with the de jure de facto question. Yeah, so I think, as Jamie said, a lot of the information that's out there, or other assessments that do this work, start with the de jure, or essentially work with that. And we were very explicit that we wanted to explore the de facto, because we think it's much more useful to understand what happens in practice. But it does ultimately, unfortunately, result that the process of doing this work and the profiles takes a lot longer, because you actually have to go out and find out what is going on in practice. In some cases, it's very straightforward. Like I said, the legislation simply says, the minister has to approve the budget, or the minister has to select the secretary, whatever. And then it's a pretty much a open and closed case. In other cases, the law may say that is not the case, but in practice it is. So in several countries, particularly the sort of where we had the hybrid instances, we noted that the practice was definitely significantly deviated from the law, and it was often deliberate. There were other cases. I don't know if, I'm just trying to think of an example in Africa, but certainly there have been cases also where the de facto is actually goes against what the law says. So for a good example of that is local governments are not allowed to have bank accounts, but in practice, many of them do. So there are lots of deviations between what the law says and the practice. And I guess we cannot, it's difficult to be, ultimately you would need unlimited resources to be 100% sure that you've ticked every box and exactly know what the de facto situation is. But we did make an effort to ensure that our local researchers were clear about whether the answers were de jure or de facto. If we were just doing a de jure assessment, the exercise would have been a lot faster. Maybe we would have done all 50 countries by now, but maybe that wouldn't have been quite as useful. And yeah, so in some countries it was very straightforward. The law is clear, the practice is clear. Elsewhere, it took quite a lot of digging to get the necessary information to make a clear assessment. On the IMF definition, yeah, take your point fully. I mean, the IMF is a controversial institution that has done many controversial things. I don't think by taking the IMF definition of local government, we are endorsing the IMF as an institution necessarily. I think the IMF definition of local government is relatively uncontroversial, but and in fact, we did modify it. The IMF doesn't talk very much about the politics, right? It looks at, is this thing a separate legal entity? Does it hire its own staff? Does it have a budget that's separate from the higher level government? Tick, it's a local government. It doesn't care whether there is political representation or this kind of thing. So we did add that in. So you can be reassured that we didn't just take the IMF definition completely unaltered. And yeah, I'm absolutely different people and different institutions will have a different view of what a local government should be defined as. I think we sort of tried to come up with something that is relatively uncontroversial, something that is generally accepted by most practitioners, and use that as a basis. Of course, it's imperfect, but we have to have something that we can use consistently across all countries. Otherwise, the comparative element is just invalid. And I think one thing I do want to emphasize is that, and maybe this didn't come across in my presentation, is that we are not interested really in doing a ranking. I don't think, at least from my perspective, we are not saying that if a local government is fully devolved, it is better than if it's deconcentrated. I would rather put my child in the Vietnamese education system, which certainly isn't devolved, than in countries where there might be a devolved sector but performs comparatively worse. I think there are many examples where deconcentrated systems produce better social outcomes than devolved institutions, and it's different everywhere. So we're certainly not saying that country X is more advanced or better than country Y. We are simply trying to understand what are the differences in the level of autonomy and authority across countries with regards to local government, because it's just not necessarily well understood from a comparative basis. So that is kind of, I wanted to just emphasize that.
And that's probably all we have time for.
I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Jamie and Jackie, you can say as little or as much as you want
Sure.
in response. And
But I know
I'm
there's a
little.
surprise waiting, so I'll be very quick, but I do want to really emphasize that last point Nick made. We as LPSA are agnostic which version of decentralization or localization or multi-level governance is best. We're completely agnostic. If it delivers the underlying outcome that you want. And that's why we started with motivation this morning. It doesn't matter if it's a red cat or a black cat if it catches mice, right? Wasn't an American who said that, I don't think. But so that's very important to us. We have no interest in prejudging which type there is. Now, Nick didn't mention devolution is better. There were people in the room who assumed it, but we didn't say it. He certainly didn't, and I don't either. What we do want is very much and very important is conceptual clarity. If you as a country are saying you're devolving, like KK does, then devolve. If you say you're devolving and you're not devolving, then you're cheating, right? So that is our purpose, is to clarify what is really going on, right? By the way, I love that there is agreement in the room that ministries of local government are not champions of local government. Please explain that to the donors. Every donor project, first thing you do is work with the Ministry of Local Government, right? Good luck, you have failed on day one. To the point, and I won't go in, Nick already clarified the IMF definition. We have improved upon it, I think. It is a global definition that we're trying to do. I do want to say, let's see, what was the, it's very important to us to be clear about the systems, because otherwise you're comparing apples and oranges. That is what we're hoping to provide. Sadly, by the way, IMF doesn't apply its own definition. Just saying, they don't do that. They came up with one and then they don't apply it. That definition has been adopted by the UN, the World Bank, OECD. Everyone adheres to that definition. That definition has been around since 1986. It is the only organization that has a consistent definition. That's why we used it, because everyone else makes up their definition as they go. So sometimes it's about democracy, then 10 years later, it's about something else. So it is a useful definition, but only as a benchmark. What you do with it depends on what your country's objective is, right? But you can't compare between countries. You can't compare Kenya and Ghana if you both say we have local governments, because they're apples and oranges. So I think that is really the thing. You'll be happy to know that you're not the only continent that doesn't do a good job benchmarking. Hopefully Boris will talk about Europe where they do a very good job, but Asia doesn't. Latin America, meh, they're getting there. But so it is a tool. You want to use it differently, you want a different definition, fine, let's work together on it. To Gertrude's point is how can we move forward? I think the key is, I'm speaking for you, Nick, sorry. I don't think, I mean, we did 7 countries, it took us over a year. Nick is a young man, he still has 20 years of a career. One option is let him do Africa and we come back in 20 years and we're good. Or probably the preferable way is let's work together and find a way that we can build a capacity in Africa to do these things in a comparative fashion. One thing we learned is that country experts have a hard time doing comparative assessments. And that is something that we collectively need to solve if we move forward together. But we're here to get the advice from you. How do we do this? We have these tools. Now what we do, we think they're useful. Are they useful? If so, how do we move forward together? So that's really it. But there's stuff waiting for us. So that's it. Thank you. Jackie,
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm not going to take any more hands because we really have run out of time. But are you staying for after tea as well? Or so can we take your question in? Is that okay? A comment. That's usually a dangerous prelude. But really, yeah, 1 minute if you can do it in 1 minute.
So yes, I think this is very useful. That's my first point. And because we need clarity in what we are talking about, as has been said here. But there's another thing I do not agree with, is what you were saying, that we don't care if it's a devolved function or if it's executed by the national government. But I think there are many studies actually showing, in terms of countries that have a better, stronger local democracy system, the citizens are happier because they have much more influence and feel that they are consulted in another way. if you compare the Nordic countries and Singapore, for instance, I think there was a study 5 years ago, Singapore is highly centralized, but very, very effective in terms of delivering services. And they live in a wonderful country, but the citizens are not happy. So I don't think we should give up that, because you are giving countries also fuel to say, no, why should we decentralize? We are happy to keep it at the central level. I mean, a little bit provoking, but so leave it here, but.
Great. This is really amazing. This means the discussion is vibrant and we're starting to really become robust, and that's exactly what we want.